The air inside the old sports hall in Istanbul was not merely hot, it was a living, breathing entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket of humid heat and raw anticipation that seemed to press down on the canvas from all sides, weighting the chests of every soul present. It was the early 70s, a time when the city straddled the line between the ancient world and the modern, and the venue reflected that gritty transition. The walls were stained with decades of sweat and echoes of past battles, the concrete cracked in places, the paint peeling to reveal the brickwork beneath. The wooden floorboards creaked under the weight of the spectators who packed the aisles, standing on tiptoes, leaning over the rails, their eyes fixed on the elevated boxing ring that stood like an altar in the center of the chaos. The lights overhead were harsh, naked bulbs encased in metal shades, casting long, deep shadows, cutting through the haze like searchlights hunting for a fugitive. The smoke from 1,000 cigarettes hung in a low cloud, a blue-gray fog that stung the eyes and lent the scene a dreamlike, almost surreal quality. This was not a place for the faint of heart. This was where reputations were forged in fire and broken in seconds. This was where truth was spoken in the language of violence. In the center of this storm stood a monument to Turkish strength and pugilistic tradition. Cengiz Öztürk, known throughout the country as the Anatolian Bull, he was a physical specimen, a heavyweight boxer who looked like he had been carved out of the very mountains he was named after. He stood tall, his silhouette cutting an imposing figure against the bright lights, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of a nation's pride. His arms were thick and powerful, ending in hands that were wrapped in red boxing gloves, weapons that had ended the careers of 34 men before him. He wore white boxing trunks with a bold red waistband, the colors of the Turkish flag, a symbol of his patriotism and his dominance. His face was a mask of hardened arrogance, his jaw set firm, and above his lips sat a thick, meticulously groomed handlebar mustache, the kind that every man in the room aspired to have, but few could pull off with such authority. He was the hero here. He was the king of this ring, and he knew it. He paced the canvas with the heavy, thudding steps of a predator surveying his territory, his eyes scanning the crowd, feeding on their adoration, their fear, their expectation of violence. He was undefeated. He had never been knocked down. He had never even been hurt. To the thousands screaming his name, he was invincible, a god of the squared circle. Cengiz had not lost a fight in years. His record was a testament to his brutality. 34 wins, 0 losses, 27 knockouts. He was a destroyer, a man who fought with the grim determination of a worker punching a clock. To him, boxing was not an art. It was a job of work. It was about bone meeting bone, about the heavy, thudding impact of leather against flesh, about endurance and power. Everything else was just noise. He had heard the rumors about his opponent tonight, a man from Hong Kong, rumored to be a master of some ancient Chinese art. Cengiz had laughed when he first heard the news. He had seen the movies. He had seen the theatrical flips and the exaggerated screams. To him, it was a circus act, a dance performed for children. He had publicly mocked the idea, telling reporters that he would break the little actor in half before the end of the first round. He expected no challenge, only a brief amusement before he sent the foreigner back to the world of make-believe. When Bruce Lee entered the hall, the atmosphere shifted, though not in the way one might expect. He did not stride in with the pomp of a conqueror. He slipped in through a side door, a small, slender figure in a simple black button-up shirt and dark slacks. He looked less like a warrior and more like a student or perhaps a quiet intellectual who had wandered into the wrong part of town. The crowd turned to look at him, and a ripple of confused murmurs went through the room. Men in the front row leaned forward, squinting through the smoke. "Is that him?" one whispered. "He looks like a boy," another scoffed. "Cengiz will kill him." The size difference was apparent even from a distance. Bruce was a blade of grass in a hurricane, a reed standing before an oak tree. Bruce walked calmly toward the ring, his movements fluid and silent. He did not look at the crowd. His eyes were fixed on the ring, his expression serene. He carried none of the tension that radiated from the other fighters in the room. He was loose, relaxed, like a leaf floating on a river, going where the current took him. He climbed the steps, the wood groaning softly under his weight, and slipped through the ropes. As he stood in the corner, the contrast became glaringly apparent. Cengiz Öztürk stood nearly a head taller and outweighed him by nearly 50 pounds of solid muscle. The visual disparity was almost comical. The Turkish giant, a mountain of power, against the Chinese philosopher. Cengiz leaned over the ropes, looking down at Bruce with a mixture of amusement and disdain. He curled his lip, revealing a flash of teeth under the handlebar mustache. He didn't need to speak English to convey his message. His posture, his sneer, the way he flexed his gloved hands, it all screamed one thing: you do not belong here. The crowd fed on this energy. They began to jeer, to shout encouragements to their champion, to mock the small man who dared to step into the Anatolian Bull's domain. "Look at him," someone shouted in Turkish. "He's trembling." It wasn't true. Bruce wasn't trembling. He was perfectly still, a statue of calm in a sea of noise. He watched Cengiz with the detached interest of a scientist observing a bacteria under a microscope. He was analyzing, measuring, understanding. The referee, a nervous man who seemed acutely aware of the historical weight of the moment, called both men to the center of the ring. The rules were simple: 3 rounds, light contact, a demonstration of skill. But as the two men faced each other, the air crackled with the unspoken promise of something more. Cengiz looked into Bruce's eyes, searching for fear. He found nothing, just a deep, dark calm that seemed to absorb the light. This irritated the Turk. He wanted to see fear. He wanted to see the whites of his opponent's eyes. He wanted the satisfaction of breaking a man's spirit before he even touched him. "You are too small," Cengiz grunted, his voice deep and gravelly. "Go home, little man." Bruce did not flinch. He simply nodded, a small, polite gesture. "I am where I need to be," he replied in English, his voice quiet but clear. "Size is just a number." The bell rang, a sharp metallic clang that shattered the silence of the last few seconds. Cengiz moved first. He did not dance or faint. He advanced, a wall of meat and muscle cutting off the ring. He moved with the momentum of a freight train, his intention clear: to corner this nuisance and crush him. He fired a jab, a heavy, thudding piston of a punch aimed at Bruce's face. It was a piston designed to measure distance and shatter resolve. It was a blow that had shattered the noses of countless contenders. But Bruce was not where the punch was aimed. He had moved. It wasn't a frantic retreat or a panic-stricken scramble. It was a subtle gliding step to his left, his body turning just enough to let the red glove graze the air where his head had been a fraction of a second before. The wind of the punch ruffled Bruce's hair, but his expression didn't change. He watched Cengiz's movement with the detached interest of a man watching a predictable movie for the second time. Cengiz grunted, annoyed. He reset his feet and threw a right cross, a blow that had ended careers. It was fast, blurring through the air. But again, Bruce was gone. He slipped under the punch, his body bending at the waist, his movements fluid as water. He was inside Cengiz's guard now, close enough to touch the Turk's chest. He didn't strike. He simply placed a palm on Cengiz's ribs, a light, patronizing tap that said, "I am here." Cengiz spun around, his gloves raised, but Bruce had already danced away, back to the center of the ring. The crowd, which had been roaring for blood, began to quiet down. They had expected a massacre. They had expected the Anatolian Bull to gore the intruder. Instead, they were watching a ghost dance around their hero. The silence was punctuated only by the heavy breathing of the Turk and the soft scuff of Bruce's shoes on the canvas. Frustration began to build in Cengiz's chest. He was the aggressor, the stronger man, the champion. He was throwing the heavy leather, but he was hitting nothing but air. He felt like a man swinging a sledgehammer at a fly. The embarrassment was starting to burn in his cheeks. He increased his tempo. Jab, Ross, hook. He threw combinations with bad intentions, his gloves whistling through the air. But Bruce Lee was a step ahead, or rather a thought ahead. He seemed to read Cengiz's intentions before the Turk's brain had even sent the signal to his muscles. He weaved under hooks, slipped jabs, and rode the force of the blows, his body moving in perfect harmony with the attacks. It was a clinic in evasion, a masterclass in efficiency. For 2 minutes, this dance continued. Cengiz stalked, throwing thunder, and Bruce flowed, offering no resistance, no target, just the frustrating emptiness of space. The giant was breathing hard now, sweat beginning to bead on his forehead and run into his eyes. He was expending energy, vast amounts of it trying to hit a shadow. Bruce, on the other hand, looked fresh, his breathing rhythmic and controlled, his skin dry. He was not fighting Cengiz's strength, he was ignoring it.
He was dismantling the Turk's timing, disrupting his rhythm, making a mockery of the concept of power. Then Cengiz saw an opening, or so he thought. He maneuvered Bruce towards a corner, cutting off the ring with his massive frame. The crowd roared, sensing the trap closing. Bruce's back touched the ropes. There was nowhere to go. Cengiz coiled his legs, his eyes narrowing. He was going to end this. He lowered his shoulder and drove forward with a massive right hook, putting his entire body weight behind the punch, intending to decapitate the smaller man. It was the punch that had knocked out 27 men. It was a hammer blow. But just as the punch was about to land, Bruce moved. It was a movement so fast, so precise, that many in the audience missed it entirely. One moment he was against the ropes, the next he was no longer there. He didn't try to block the punch. He didn't try to run. He stepped into the attack. He dropped his level, his shoulder checking Cengiz's chest, redirecting the giant's momentum. Simultaneously, his right hand shot out. A vertical fist, a finger jab that stopped precisely 1 inch from Cengiz's throat. The collision never happened. Cengiz's forward motion was arrested instantly. His eyes bulged. He froze, his gloves suspended in midair. The arena fell into a tomb-like silence. It was the silence of realization, of a collective held breath. For 3 agonizingly long seconds, the world stopped. Everyone in the hall understood the truth. Bruce Lee had not just stopped the Anatolian Bull. He had held his life in his hand, 1 inch forward, and the fight would have been over. The trachea would have been crushed. The champion would have fallen. Not because of muscle, but because of precision. Not because of force, but because of understanding. Bruce held the pose for a heartbeat longer, his eyes locked on Cengiz's. There was no malice in them, only a calm, terrifying clarity. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lowered his hand. He stepped back, giving the stunned giant space. He did not gloat. He did not raise his hands in victory. He simply stood there, calm, his chest barely rising and falling, a quiet testament to the power of control.
Cengiz Öztürk stood paralyzed. The arrogance, the mockery, the pride, it had all been stripped away in that 3-second silence. He looked at the small man in the black shirt who had just bested him without throwing a single punch. He looked at his own gloves, then at the canvas. The fire in his eyes was gone, replaced by a stunned, humble recognition. He realized then that he had been fighting a ghost, a man who understood the mechanics of combat on a level he couldn't even comprehend. The Turkish flag on his waistband seemed to weigh heavier now, a symbol not of dominance, but of a lesson learned. The silence broke as Bruce bowed, a deep, formal bow of respect. It was a gesture that broke the spell. Cengiz blinked, the reality of his defeat crashing down on him. The referee, seeing the fight was over, waved his arms, but no one was watching him. The crowd was on its feet, not cheering for a knockout, but applauding a revelation. They had come to see a fight, they had witnessed a lecture on the nature of power. They had seen a giant mocked by his own assumptions, and they had seen a master demonstrate that true strength lies not in the size of the fist, but in the silence of the mind. Cengiz took a deep, ragged breath. He reached up and unlaced his right glove with his teeth. He pulled the glove off and extended his bare hand. "You are something else," he whispered, his voice cracking with emotion. "I did not see it. I did not understand." Bruce took the hand, his grip firm. "It is not about seeing," he replied softly. "It is about understanding. You have power. But power without direction is just noise." As they stood in the center of the ring, hand in hand, the contrast between them remained, the giant and the philosopher, the bull and the dragon. But the dynamic had shifted forever. The mocking laughter had died in the opening round. The silence that followed spoke louder than any cheer. It was the silence of all. And in that silence, the legend of the Anatolian bull and the dragon was written, not in blood, but in the quiet language of mastery. As Bruce turned to leave the ring, the image of Cengiz Öztürk standing still, his hand extended in respect, was burned into the memories of everyone present. They left the hall that night carrying a new truth, a truth that had been delivered in 3 seconds of absolute silence.